happy to see everybody. And I'll kind of throw in here well, I'm Eric, and I'm out here in Newport Beach, California. And essentially what we're going to be covering today, as you can see, is this presentation that I gave at IECA. I also gave it at NACAC this year. And my co-presenter, Lee, won't be in attendance, but it's kind of for the better because I'm usually the one to do all the talking anyways. And she's really responsible for all of the actual data background and all the visualizations in this presentation. So I want to give a lot of credit to Lee. She actually had about 10 years of experience as an IEC before starting her own admissions data company. And what she does is take all of these different databases that we'll review today, and she compiles them and then also creates derived statistics. Think of like draw rate, for example, where they create a ratio around the admissions rate and the yield rate, and then you can kind of get the popularity of like how selective is the school and then how many of the students they admit actually get in. So the draw rate would be that, and that would be an example of a derived statistic. So we'll cover a lot of stuff today, but for the most part, you should come away from today's talk with a full overview of the major data sources, how to vet them, and essentially how to build them into your own practice if that's of interest to you. So we'll go ahead and jump in. And also feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. We'll likely address them at the end because if there's multiple questions of the same question in the Q&A, we can kind of jump on that and address them all at once. At the same time, if there's something that's just really pressing, Carmen's going to be monitoring all of the comments and questions there. So we'll be able to bring it up should we need to. But we'll definitely have some time at the end. So I'll go ahead and jump in and forgive the slide deck being for IECA. I was kind of stuck on a template, so we'll kind of, just bear with it. But nonetheless, let's jump in. So we're going to kick it off with really just asking ourselves, like, why data? And I think this first, piece that we can see is by far the most powerful one that I've seen in really the last few years. And the big thing here is that this is the last 20 years of the number of students admitting to schools. And I should say that it's actually the number of students and the number of their applications, because that blue line you see on the top is the raw number of applications submitted for the entire country. Every student, every application submitted. The far left is back in 2001. And to put this into perspective, that was roughly when I was applying. I was a 2002 high school graduate. And at the time, there's about 1.2 million students applying, that green line on the bottom, and there were 4.6 million applicants. So you got to think about 3 or 4 applications per student, which is pretty typical, at least back then. But the problem is that the second that any given school feels like it's out of reach, that really parents, not even the students, start to feel like, oh, it's harder to get into UC Santa Barbara now. It's harder to get into USC now. They're going to react. And the way that they're going to react is because they have this misconception that admissions is a lottery, they're going to submit more applications. But what that does on the university side is now instead of having the universities are competing with like 3 or 4 other schools on who they admitted, they're competing with like 10 or 12. And so you see this kind of natural growth, and it's really nobody's fault. This is much more like a human nature sort of result than it is, anything nefarious at all. Because you can see that steady growth in the number of applicants over that time to where, there was a little bit of an increase in the number of students, right? It went from 1.2 million in 2001 to 1.5 million. So you have a 25% increase. That's pretty fair. But you can see with the blue line, the number of applications grew from 4.6 million to 11.4 million. So you went from, which would be closer to, it's about a 150% increase compared to a 25% increase with the number of students. And really it's because you can see students went from applying to 3 or 4 schools each to closer to like 9 or 10 schools each. And we all know the students that applied to way more than that. But all of this is just a reaction to the perception that school's harder to get into than ever, which is partially true. It's harder to get into school than ever to the brand name, to the most exclusive or most rejected type of schools, but there's more universities than ever and more spots than ever. So it's actually easier to get into schools. And what this really represents and as a result of is people pursuing that brand name and people pursuing really those top 100 type schools. And to really illustrate that one step further, you can see how the yield rate, these gray bars, have dropped over the same period of time, where if a school admitted a student, there was a 42% chance they'd end up attending just across the board back in 2001. It's almost been cut in half, and it's closer to 22% now. So if you've been in this business for at least 5, if not 10, or especially 20 years, you probably have this feeling that you're like, you know what? It's just so much more unpredictable these days. Some students get in that we think wouldn't. Some students get in that we thought should, or that don't get in and we thought they should have. But it's because that yield rate is dropping and all of these enrollment managers are trying to scramble to keep up. So if you sense that unpredictability, it's not just a gut instinct, it's actually happening. And I think that's one of the key parts of data and kind of this presentation is having been on the test prep and tutoring side of this for almost 20 years now. I've been a kind of fly on the wall to all of this. And so while I'm not a practicing IEC, I don't do any sort of college counseling, my background in kind of culture and power and a lot of how these things get established and kind of the why behind them has always been really interesting. So seeing that, kind of the way I've liked to compare this before is that if you've been an IEC for at least 5, if not those 10 or 20 years, think of it kind of the same as like an art dealer being able to spot a fake. You might not be able to explain it to an everyday person as to why, but you just know. And in that same way, you've seen it get more and more unpredictable. You do have this institutional knowledge that you get to carry with you, and data in a lot of ways can help confirm that, and we'll kind of dive into more of those themes as we move on. But it's not just you, it really is much more unpredictable these days.
Eric, can I interrupt you? What do the colors of the chart represent?
Oh, sure. So this was going back to this original one. So the blue line is the number of the number of applications submitted total. Just so that's why that's higher than the number of students. The actual number of students, the enrollees, is the green line here. And then the red one were the people who got rejected from any of those applications. The yellow is how many admissions were offered. So you could see that the enrollees, the number of students attending college or applying to college for that fall, grew from 1.2 million to 1.5. But with the applications growing, you had a lot more admissions because the yield rate went down. The schools have to admit more students because they're not sure that many are going to attend. And the non-admits ended up growing over the same period of time as well. So again, just the real two big colors for me are the green and the blue, because the green is the raw number of students, the blue is the raw number of applications. And you can just really see that the applications are far outpacing the growth in students. And then overlaying this exact same data on the yield rate is this one. So I think this one doesn't have a key, but same numbers, same years, same data, except overlaid with the yield rate. And you could see the yield rate drop almost in half over the same period of time. And then going back to this one, this is the total amount of admissions fees, or applications fees, I should say, in 2001 and 2020, but broken down by whether they were admitted but didn't enroll, which would be the blue, the red, which is that they were not admitted, and then the green, which is they were admitted and attended. And what stands out to me here is that despite all of these other admissions, despite even the growth in the number of students attending, the cost or the total amount of application fees paid by students who actually ended up enrolling dropped by $3 million over that 20-year span. But look at this massive increase, both in the students who were admitted but didn't attend, that giant blue part, but this 313 million on application fees paid by students who weren't admitted. I forget exactly some of these numbers, but to give you a rough estimate, I think the UCs are about $60 each to apply to. You correct me if I'm wrong on that, but as a rough number. And it's a place like UCLA or Berkeley has close to 100,000 applicants. I mean, you're looking at, what would that be? That's a $6 million application fee sort of taken, which means that their admissions department has a $6 million marketing budget to get more, beyond what the school's giving them already. But just from application fees, a school like UCLA would have $6 million in application fees just to pour back into getting more applications. And again, the universities aren't doing anything nefarious. They want to promote themselves. They want people to apply, and they bring down their admissions rate like that. The rankings play into that. And it becomes this kind of vicious cycle of, well, people applying to way too many schools. And you can see $313 million spent by families just to not get admitted. Kind of tough. And so,
sorry. Is that graph taking into account the kids applying to UCs that are waivers?
No, this only has to do with people paying for paying for the full application fee. So okay, this wouldn't include any waiver students. Yeah. And really every single part of college admissions is data. And I know we can talk about fit. I know we can talk about feel. There's a lot of subjective pieces to the value and how much families want to go to a certain school or a student does. But I'd kind of compare it more to like baseball, where practically every play has a start and a stop point, and you can pull data from it. So all of these pieces like admit rates or ROI, net price, you can really break down and create a full picture for any given family. But there's a caveat. It's all contextual. And the reason it's contextual is that, as a really quick example, you can't compare like a 5% admissions rate at Stanford with a 10% admissions rate at, let's say, Georgetown, because each pool of students is self-selecting. They're not equal pools. If you gave every single high school student equal access and they all submitted an application and it was the exact same application, then you could do like a cross comparison. But since every pool of students applying is self-selecting where they want to apply, you really can't even compare admissions rates, other than, really admissions rates isn't a good metric at all, to be perfectly honest, because there's a lot of people that would have applied. In fact, I'm a great example. With my alma mater, Berkeley, I almost didn't apply. And I had the UC application, and my college counselor asked me, do you have something against Berkeley? You have UCLA and you have UC San Diego. Why not Berkeley? And I told him, I think it's because I wouldn't get in. And he's like, well, at least, you have the grades, it's there, like, just take a shot. Like, you're actually in the running. And I did, and it worked out. But I had already self-selected myself out of that pool without his prompting. And the same thing happens with students wanting to chase a brand or just thinking that they wouldn't have a chance. So again, it's all contextual, but it really depends more on the family's resources and their goals than anything else. And so overall, though, too, as a college counselor, data has kind of endless benefits. It helps you find kind of the deeper details of a school, and even on some of the pieces like, for example, violence on campus or like crimes on campus, sports scholarships and how many they have to offer. There's still so many families that we work with on the tutoring side even that think, Tommy's going to get a golf scholarship. Okay, well, if they only have a certain amount of scholarships and the max that they can offer is like a quarter or maybe a 50% scholarship, it's impossible to get that full ride that the parent has had in their head for years and years. Like you see them out, training all the time, and it's really not going to happen to the degree that they think. But also it really serves as your defense, because a lot of families are going to believe what they want to believe. And I've done other presentations on debunking the ranking system and going into the science and methodology of like US News and World Report and why they're just fake. They're completely manufactured. The rankings are one of the most insidious pieces of all of, just higher admissions to me, or higher education. But the data allows you to sit back and know that they might not want to hear the truth. They might not want to discuss it, but at least in your professional grounding that, well, kind of that you're right, or that a family might just be kind of focused on the wrong priorities there. And you kind of can't control that. They just want to go to the top 10 schools and no matter what, in their mind, that's the value add. And the rumors abounding in higher ed, I swear, practically every presentation I've given, there's a hand in the back that's like, well, I had a student, and that's because everyone has an outlier. If you work with even 20 students as an IEC a year, 25, 30, even if you have 2 or 3 of those that were really surprising on their admissions results, that feeling of their result is going to have an outsized influence. So there's always going to be an exception to the rule, and there's always going to be a surprise. But the data at least lets you see that in that greater context. But these can all be overwhelming. The visualizations, understanding them, the data itself, and we'll look at some of the kind of the raw outputs here and kind of how you can convert that, but I'll take you through it step by step because really you just don't need to be afraid. This can be scary in a sense of like if you're not really a math person or a data person, but we're going to keep this on like a Wikipedia level today, and we won't be diving into any major sort of calculations or anything like that. But you don't need to be a data scientist. And what we're going to focus more on is data literacy so that you could start to see, let's say instead of being that art dealer, like I mentioned before, that can spot a fake, maybe you don't have that level of like insight on the art pieces or in higher ed, but you can at least spot like which artists or which era they came from, because you should at least know like what's available, what's out there, what its limitations are, that there's not some data on some things. You know, schools don't, if they don't have to release it, they typically don't. And I have a feeling that the common data set will probably go away in the next few years. It's not required. It's put forth by private entities. And as valuable as it is, if the schools don't have to release information, they probably won't. But also just kind of debunking a lot of that conventional wisdom. I mean, for me, the families chasing the brand and really going into debt over different brands is completely misguided because, for example, out here in California, between our community college and Cal State system, there is no better economical option for a family for the most part than that route. And you can get really any degree that you could from any sort of brand name, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Chicago, in the Cal State system. There is really no special unique degree that you couldn't already get at a more cost-effective option. So data's just good for presenting, okay, great, it sounds like you're chasing a brand. How valuable is that brand? And is it worth that extra 50K a year, 100K a year? I mean, these prices go up, and it's not just the tuition, but being in like Greek life or going on that spring break trip and so on. So it just helps situates families better in whatever their kind of scenario is. And I'd say lastly here, just kind of going back to this other part about why data, is there's something really unique about higher education and specifically college admissions, where to me, there's no greater moment in a family's life. And I can say this with my own daughter being a junior in high school, and you know, we're kind of grappling with the same thing on like, you know, cost versus where she wants to go and what she wants to major in and will that set her up for a good career. But there's really no greater moment of anxiety and fear and trepidation because there's so many parking lot rumors. There's so many like PTA rumors out there and that sort of thing. And you're taking someone's kids, you're taking their hard-earned money, you're taking their kids' future and kind of everything that they've worked for and their kind of identity that they've crafted for themselves, and you're putting it into one thing. And it's probably going to be more expensive than anything they'll ever spend on in their life for the most part. And I say that because if you have more than one kid, it's probably going to be even more than your house if you're going full pay. So, you know, it's a pretty major decision. And I think in having kind of worked with so many different IECs over the years, just from business development and building tutoring company and stuff, there's a lot of people that do it great. And there's a lot of people that understand the gravity that comes with this. I think there's a lot of people that get into it because they think it's fun. And I think those people are doing a disservice because it's not just about filling out an application and being kind of a checklist helper or saying like, oh, this would be a great fit. That's kind of going and doing like some sort of like clothing shopping with someone and not looking at price tags and just saying that looks great on you. Right. I mean, instead it's, no, what are you going for? You know, what's your budget? What's your identity? What's your goal with this? And then you would shop for clothes accordingly. But you do have people that just chase high fashion or kind of traffic in that. And that's fine, but you probably have to have about $500,000 per student, given the costs and tuition and living expenses and everything else. And so as far as what we're going to cover today, this is kind of our table of contents. We're going to start with some mandated government databases like IPEDS, College Scorecard, and so on. We'll move on to the common data set, and we'll look at some publicly available or like scrapable options that you could pull data from yourself, some quick pitfalls to avoid, and then finally we'll wrap up with kind of how to vet data, kind of why data can be really powerful in small batches. For example, we just had an election And you kind of always see those confidence intervals, like plus or minus 3%, and they surveyed X amount of people. And it's because you really only need a couple hundred, maybe 300 or 400 instances to get about a national take on any given subject if you're randomizing your sample. So for those of you that have been in the business for 10, 20 years, if you've carried 20 or 30 students a year, you really do have a statistical confidence interval within about 3% as to whether that student would get in or not. And you hold that, just like that art dealer being able to spot a fake. So we'll work on kind of vetting data, and we'll work through those numbers a little bit more. And finally, how to incorporate data into working with families and students and seeing how it can benefit them as well. And so just as a quick overview of the government sources, IPEDS is really great on the front end. It's also one of the most extensive databases. If you try to download the whole thing at once, it'll probably crash Excel. You would actually need to use a bigger database like Microsoft Access. But you can download these bits and pieces, which we'll walk through in a second. And there's not really a great use for IPEDS though on the back end, like salary data, return on investment, pieces like that, debt. But College Scorecard kind of picks up on the back end where IPEDS falls off. College Scorecard, again, pretty huge database with over 2,900 fields, but they really only share about 120 on the site. So if you download the raw data, there's way more data than they have on the site. And it is way more outcome focused, like kind of more practically focused on, salaries and debt and pieces like that. And then finally, with equity and athletics and the campus safety data cutting tool, if you have interests in either of these pieces, like funding and funding by sport or just campus data, safety and stuff, we'll provide these resources and do a quick sort of overview of how to use those. Very user-friendly. IPEDS is by far the least user-friendly of all of these right now. And so if you go to the IPEDS website, if I get the acronym right, I'm almost positive that it's Intersegmental Post-Secondary Education Data Set, I think. I might have a word off there. But it's required by any college that receives federal funding. They're forced to report these different metrics, and there's a lot of them. So if you have a specific niche data piece, you can actually go in and find that one data piece. And it gets so granular that even on like the test prep side for me, we can go into not just their middle 50th percentile on a test, but we can go to a middle 50th percentile of a subsection of like an SAT or ACT, and even break it out by gender, by age, and there's just so many different little pieces that you can see. So where you'd start though is once you go to the website, this kind of survey data on the far right, and then selecting which download option is where you'll start. And you want to start with the custom data files because the complete is just going to be huge. And so once you click that, this is the next thing that'll come up. And these are the different like broad categories that they have for each data set. And there's hundreds of fields within each of these. And you can see kind of the fall enrollment, 12-month enrollment, outcome measures, and so on. So this is kind of that broad level where you'd want to start just from a categorical perspective. And you can also choose which schools you want to see it from. So here, I went ahead and selected my alma mater, Berkeley. And so now that I have Berkeley selected, I can pull any of those different categories or sub pieces from it. And it looks like this, where you have these kind of little, not decision tree, but like an organizational tree, where if you click on any of these plus signs, it'll bring up all the subcategories beneath that. So for me, working in test prep, if we wanted to look at SAT and ACT scores, you can see all the different types of data that they track. And they also provide it for the last 20 years. And so the data piece that we started off with, as far as the amount of applications increasing over time, but the amount of students not really increasing, that was built specifically from exactly this data, where Lee went in and she chose the last 20 years and she chose the number of applications total, and then mapped out that the blue line on there. And then the number of students attending, there's the green one. So some pretty powerful visualizations can be built off of even a single piece of data or two. But it's really wherever your interest lies, you can go through, pick the ones you want, and once you highlight the years and the data pieces, it'll create a spreadsheet for you. But if you wanted to see a different piece, it would be right here. So for example, how many applicants were there total, split between men and women, were they enrolled, full-time or part-time? It gets incredibly granular. So I have a lot of fun with this. I find it incredibly interesting just to like review and see different trends over multiple years. But if you had wanted any one piece of data, especially on the front end of admissions, even including things like people, how many are applying with waivers, that's in here too. They have the amount of Pell Grant students as well, and proportionately to the number of students at the university overall. So I can say that that's in there, but since this isn't like a live look at their website rather than a slide, I can't bring it up at the moment, but things like that will definitely be there.
Eric, when will IPEDS include 2021, 2022 data?
You know what? That's a good question as to when it's released each year. I'll tell you what, maybe Carmen or Cindy, if you just Google that for me real quick, because it is at a certain time each year. I forget. Yeah, but it is updated annually. So it should be there shortly if it's not already. Because I did pull these slides a couple months ago, so it may have updated since then. And this is what it looks like though. And so if you were thinking about like, I don't want to deal with data, it's frustrating, it scares me, well, this is your worst nightmare. This is exactly the part you were probably dreading. But each of these acronyms at the top has a glossary that it's tied to, and you can see exactly what it is. So when you clean it up, it starts to look like this, where this is just looking at the institutional data as far as like address, website, pieces like that. But getting back into what that data would look like, it starts to look like this, where you have the name of the university, and up at the top, you can see there's like 6-year graduation rate, the percentage of, or like how many applications they had total and so on. Oh, and thank you, Cindy. The data is collected in October of each year. And with this though, once you have it, you can cross compare and basically just change the headers, which is really just going to the glossary, matching them up. And you have this full data set where you can see exactly what their admissions rate were, their graduation rates. I mean, there's a ton of financial data that comes up here as well. And one of the things that sticks out to me with IPEDS is that their financial data, at least as far as like household income, caps at $110,000. You know, a lot of these headers are a little bit shortened just because they were, the cells are kind of small, but those different average net prices are, for example, I think there's like a $15,000, a $30,000 level, and I won't get these numbers exactly right, but like a 30 to 48,000, 49 to let's say 65, whatever those ranges are. So they have, 5 or 6 different income ranges for lower income families, but it caps at 110,000, which for me, even out here in California, that's like 2 school teachers. And it's just kind of another way that not all of the data is shared, because they don't have the average net prices for example, people making over $250,000, because there's probably a handful of students whose parents make that much, but they still get merit aid, and the parents or the schools don't want to admit it, or at least show that someone making that much or with that type of income level would get any type of merit aid. So in short, the data isn't always the whole story. There's usually a story behind how the data is constructed or presented even. But if you were able to take all of that data and line up the different schools that you wanted, you could get a breakdown like this. And these are the income tiers that I was talking about. So less than 30K, 30 to 48, 48 to 75, and so on. And what we did here is we masked the names of the schools so that the 78K, 69K, 40K on the far left, we put those as in place of the school name. And instead we put their full price sticker price. So you can see for a family that let's say is making between 30 and 48,000, that school that would cost 55,000 is going to cost that family 43,000 a year. But you can see 2 of the most expensive ones, or really all of the ones that are in the 70,000 mark, are all under 10,000 a year. So especially for like a price conscious family, a low income family, to me this decision is clear as day. If they got into all of these schools, they have to go to one of those schools that actually was one of the most expensive, but to them is going to be much cheaper than even schools that appeared cheaper from a sticker price perspective. And all of this has to do with the discount rate scenario, which I really don't think it's healthy, and is probably one of the worst parts of college admissions, because it's really this, what it is on the high end at all these private schools like USC or Harvard, is they want to round out their class with, the students that are capable and bring all the metrics and the reputation and the scores and the grades. But the more full pay students they can get at that, the better. They have a better, they have more income from their class. Their revenue per student goes up, but they also need the athletes, and they need the legacies, and they need even like any student that's just going to fit that demographic or bring whatever reputational gain that the school is looking for. So they're going to discount that full sticker price. And what ends up happening, though, is you end up with a campus, and USC is probably one of the most segregated in this way, where you pretty much are on a full scholarship or you are full pay. And you end up with, the reason I use segregated is that you have a group that can afford a Greek life and afford to go on spring break and afford to, close and not have to work during college. And you have a group that's on full pay and really can't access a lot of those things. So it's this sliding scale of the school trying to get as much money as they can and have as much of a reputation as they can. And yes, you can game it and you can find deals, but the system itself is just a little rough to me. But again, from data, you can kind of pull out what the reality is and let those families make decisions that are best for them on what they want to pay and the value of the schools that come with it, or at least to them. And a lot of that's so subjective too, because like, for example, having been born and raised in California, Duke or Vanderbilt or Tufts are great schools, but they kind of mean nothing to me. I mean, I know of them, I know the names, but if you ask me to differentiate beyond geography, I wouldn't even really know where to start. And so much of it has to do with the family's valuation of that school. And even working in test prep, one of the most fun things is working live online. We get students from all over the world. And so to hear why that student from Singapore who had a parent that, went to North Carolina just can't apply to Duke because of the family's, rivalry or something, or like, how did someone from Columbia even hear about, Santa Clara or something like that? So it's always fun to see what stands out to them and really what their values are too, as a family, and what their goals are. So the data can just always help build that clearer picture too. Moving on to the College Scorecard, way more user-friendly than IPEDS. And in fact, you don't even need to download any data. You can just search a school or a field of study, or I like this one, these pre-selected options, where you can just find schools close by, schools that are easier to get into, or what degree level you might want. And I think one of the greatest attributes of the College Scorecard is really cost and debt. Using Berkeley here, there's just a quick view that here's your average annual cost, even though the sticker price is a lot more, a graduation rate. It compares it to the midpoints for all the other four-year schools. And I really like that this gives a real quick, real world picture for what's going on in that school. So if you're in a meeting with a family, you bring up College Scorecard really quickly and put a couple schools on it, it's just a great overview to have at hand if that conversation comes up. But you can download all the different data, which you could go to their data files and get to. But again, it's going to look like IPEDS. You're going to want to pick out which data points you want and kind of match up the glossary the same way. But again, it's really powerful on the outcome, and I'd say more so, I like these two stats of the income 3 years after graduation and 8 years after graduation. Because with College Scorecard, what they exclude on those are students that are still in grad school or not working. So you don't have this amount kind of brought down by people that just aren't making that much money. Instead, it's like if they're in the workforce, this is what they're getting, or this is what they're earning with those types of degrees or majors. And as far as like what the back end, like return on investment or career prospects and things like that, what we did on this slide is we broke down just from a broad major perspective, starting with on the far left, engineering and computer science, healthcare, architecture, business, hard sciences, and so on. And this is the median income 3 years after graduation. So these are 25-year-olds, essentially, if they graduated on time. But I want you to notice that only those first four engineering and computer science, healthcare, architecture, and business are at or above $50,000. And it's because when you start to factor in cost of living, most of these are under about $45,000, which is a rough cost of living in most major metro areas here in the US. And so even within computer science or healthcare, half of the people are getting less than this because these are medians. And so when we start to compare that to earnings by major or the amount of debt, it starts to show you that a lot of those returns, a lot of the wage increases that were promised to a lot of people that through like the 80s and 90s and early 2000s saying, go to college, you'll make $1 million more in your lifetime, 2 million more. There's some truth to that, but the earnings really didn't pan out the way people expected because a lot of those profits went to the very top. And that's just kind of the kind of classic American economy of the last 20, 40 years. And if we start looking at like, does a brand matter or not? It does and it doesn't. It does in certain areas. And what you can see here is in this one, we broke down those same broad major categories. So same categories as here. We broke down into what those earnings were by the different 20th percentiles, and at the far left of each of these cells is schools with an admissions rate of 0 to 20%. The next one in from the left is going to be from 20 to 40, and 60 to or 40 to 60, and so on. And so what you can see on the far left, some of these are skewed, like business, computer science, even liberal arts. And what that means is that if you're in a school that's in the top 20% of that they have a selectivity under 20%, you typically make more. And that makes sense because in business, it's a brand name driven business. Same thing as kind of law. Honestly, even in tutoring, right? They don't really hire people that went to a school that doesn't have that prominent brand name. So there are specific areas where the brand does matter, but even then you can see it kind of flatten out after that first band of selectivity. So you're either in like the hardest schools to get into, and in certain majors, it can have a value. But if you're planning on going into teaching or you're planning on going into healthcare, you can see those two are pretty much flat. And the reason for that is that these are like more like contract type institutions. They're more like system-based institutions where if you're a teacher, you've got your salary and you have like a lockstep growth. If you're a doctor, you work in that hospital system. So there's definitely some majors and areas where the brand does matter, but even then it's only the top groups that have or schools that have less than a 20% admissions rate. Otherwise, it's kind of a wash. And this is why I'm a big proponent, for example, of like Long Beach out here in California, because Long Beach is an amazing city, super diverse, just got everything going on, world-class city. And it's got a great kind of community culture to it too. And Long Beach State offers pretty much every undergraduate degree that you could get at any one of these schools that's going to be in the most selective band. And so to me, it's like, what do you really want? Do you want the sweater with the name on it? Or do you want the degree that's going to get you to the career you want and hopefully at a price you want? And
Eric, those
yeah,
5 bars, do they represent the years?
The bars were by selectivity level. So the far left would be a selectivity of 0 to 20%, and then the next bar over is 20 to 40%, and the height of them is their earnings.
Okay, thank you.
Totally. And when we get to debt, though, this one's really important to me because I've lived this. I was lucky enough to graduate with no debt. Lucky enough to have parents help out and lived really frugally, and I got to graduate with no debt. But if you go back to, I'd actually encourage everyone to think of, there's this calculator put out by MIT. And you can just Google MIT cost of living calculator. And this is where I pulled about that $45,000 mark for just a living wage. And it breaks it down by whether you're single, whether you have a kid, how many kids, whether you're a couple or not. And it looks at, you can sort it by city, county, state, but the most powerful one to me is by sorting it by metro area. And if you look at the greater, New York, LA, San Francisco Bay Area, Chicago, DC, across the board, it's about $45,000 a year for cost of living. That's total gross top line for just a single adult. No kids, no partner, just living on your own. But you saw, going back to one of these other slides, that most students aren't making that coming out. They're not even making baseline, right? So just living expenses. But if they take out these different loan amounts, where on the far left here, if they took out $5,000 a year, they're going to have a total loan of $20,000. And typical student loan interest rates have held around 6%. So to this minimum monthly payment and cost per year before taxes would be if you wanted to pay it off within 10 years. Because to me, I think you should have your student debt paid off within 10 years. In fact, I'm a believer that no one should pay for college. I think that we should just invest in it as a public good, because we can see how difficult the student debt crisis is. But given the system that we're in, this is what it would take to pay it off within 10 years. But what you're also asking of someone who's 25 or 28 when they want to go to a destination wedding with their friends, or like they want to go on a trip, or they want to buy that thing or whatever it may be, you're going to ask them to pay whatever one of these monthly payments for 10 years straight without fail just to pay it off. And if you don't, you've already passed 32, which is when a lot of people, if they haven't already, want to settle down, get married, buy a home, have kids. And if you have this debt hanging over you, it's going to influence every aspect of your life. And it's to the point where, you could categorize it as slavery, you could categorize it as indentured servitude, whatever label you want to throw on it. It's insidious, and debt will truly infect every decision someone makes as an adult. And I don't think a lot of 18-year-olds understand what they're getting into. Because when you start to expand this out and you add the cost of living to this, and what I did is I added about 20% to each of this cost a year before taxes, because you can't even write off your loan. You can't even claim it against taxes and stuff. Maybe the interest, but it's so nominal, it really doesn't matter. But on this far right, that's what a student has to make straight out of college, and at least that for 10 years, making these payments to pay off the loan on the far left. And so to me, a student taking out $100,000 total is not uncommon these days. But you'd be asking that students to pay $1,100 a month, and they'd just barely be able to meet cost of living and paying off their loan, making $60,000 a year, which again, going back to those medians, most majors aren't making. So yes, there are definitely some success stories, but the way I want to compare this is it's not like you get to kind of blast off to college and achieve all these things, and at the very worst, you fall into like this nice bed of pillows where you're taken care of and everyone's happy. Instead, you're kind of on a trapeze over a shark tank where you very much can slip. And if you fall, and if you either don't graduate or don't get into that career path or have that outsized debt, it can be something that continues to increase, because there's something specific about student loan debt that it's very much consumer debt. It is very much like credit card debt, where if you don't pay it, it's just going to simply keep growing and you'll be earning interest on top of interest. Whereas, for example, with business debt or like a mortgage debt, that's kind of like equity debt in a way, where you have something tangible with it. And if you don't pay it, it's a fixed payment and you might have a penalty, but it's not going to be where you just have to, it's not going to keep metastasizing more and more to where you end up owing more than you even started off with, for example. So you just need to be careful. You don't want one of your students to fall into that shark pit of debt and just kind of job opportunities. And then shifting over to equity in athletics, this is a quick one where if you wanted to see how much schools spend or like how many people are in each sport, you can choose up to 4 different schools to compare. And I just chose a bunch of Southern California schools here to compare. And then you can see their budgeting. And one thing that sticks out to me here is that the C on here is USC, and their men's teams have $11.5 million that they spend. That they have in revenue. Football is 9 million of that. Basketball is $1.5 million. So there's $1 million remaining for all the other sports combined. So again, if you're not in basketball or football, probably not a ton of funding there. And another thing that I wanted to mention about sports, this is a totally free website, but I love it. It's called scholarshipstats.com, and it breaks down all of the total amount of students playing sports in either boys or girls sports, and then it compares that to how many play in college at all, how many play Division I, and what those odds are of playing any of those. And what stands out to me is, for example, like if we have, like with soccer, I mean, I forget how many people there are on a soccer team, even if we round up to 20. So most leagues out here are going to be 5 or 6 high schools. So one player out of 5 or 6 high schools will end up playing in Division I. And I just don't think that parents understand how like small those odds are to play Division I or even get any type of scholarship through sports. And this is just a really quick reference to let them know what they're up against. And then this isn't the most fun topic because no one wants to think about the seedier side of higher education, but violence does happen on campuses, and robberies and burglaries and just crime in general. And so this has the exact same format as the equity in athletics breakdown, where you can choose up to 4 schools and cross compare. And in this one, it just shows the total amount of different crimes there, but you can also use it per 1,000 students to get more of a ratio feel rather than a volume, because of course Ohio State's going to have way more of every type of crime because they have like 50,000 something students, whereas like a Santa Clara from a raw perspective might have fewer instances, but proportionately that may be more or less than a bigger school. So moving into the common data set, so it's not required, which is why I think it might go away in a couple of years. But it's actually great for both merit scholarship and early decision info, but it's not aggregated. You really have to go in and download things, one school at a time. And so this is where I'll give a quick pitch to Lee and More College Data, because she does aggregate those. And so that's using her or any other third-party service. You can have someone do it for you. But it does include things like class rank and wait list. But I have this buyer beware piece at the bottom because this is who the common data set is built by, right? This is pulled directly from the common data set's webpage, where the 3 groups who fund it and organize it are the College Board, US News and World Report, and Peterson's. So to put this into perspective, you have the people responsible for manufacturing and creating and putting in all the propaganda of testing and why we should have more SAT and ACT. You have people behind all of the advertising and propaganda and marketing of rankings with the US News and World Report. And then you have the textbook people who don't just want to sell you a new textbook every year, but every semester. And so I couldn't think of 3 worse people, like kind of like the 3 horses of the apocalypse of higher education than these 3. But they did band together to create a data set, and it has been kind of valuable. But I just don't see it continuing because it's not required. And again, I don't think colleges really want to freely give information that they don't need to. One of those derived statistics that you can get from something like the common data set, though, is this one that Lee actually created herself, which is called Scholarship Melt. And I love this one, where what we've done here is the far left bar is the university themselves, and we've masked their names so we're not like outing any of them by just putting their sticker price there. So you can kind of have an idea for what some of these schools might be just by their sticker price or full pay price. The next column over, the percentage of first years without need who got aid. So that's the amount of students who had no aid but received some type of, or sorry, they had no need, but they received some type of merit aid. But then this next bar is how many graduated without that same aid. So in short, if we use this very first one of $46,000 a year sticker price, 76% of students who did not demonstrate need received some type of merit aid, but only 38% graduated with the same aid. So they lost it because of either a GPA requirement or who knows why they lost it. But to me, if you think of, like, for example, this worst offender of 50%, but even something like 20, 26, 34% of students are going to lose that merit aid. You know, a merit aid student typically is kind of going because they like the brand, they like the school, they're getting a little bit of a discount, but that little bit of a discount might be $10, $20, $30,000. And if you map that out over 2 or 3 extra years, that can be a huge hit to a family. And even more so, The fact that the student's already on campus, they've already got it all over their Instagram, they're wearing the sweater, they've identified it with it. They're not leaving at that point. So to me, the fact that anyone can lose any type of merit scholarship is insane to begin with, but it does exist, and some schools are way worse offenders than others. So just another one of those kind of derived statistics that stands out there. And these are essentially, to me, like the kind of bait and switch universities. They're usually like middle tier private schools that dangle a discount rate only for the student to lose it. And sadly, that's kind of the way they do business. As far as like publicly available data or scrapable data, I do this a ton for demographic data, or like just, income, cities, anything like that. And you can use something as simple as Wikipedia. Those kind of data sets that they have, you really can just copy and paste it right there. But you want to make sure you're not using stuff that somebody else has compiled, or at least sell it all you want for just your own insights. But the second you try to reproduce and sell something that you've copy and pasted, it gets a little dangerous. And there's a ton of other databases, and even like Chrome extensions like Instant Data Scraper and Parse, where if you went to a site like Wikipedia that has a chart or a table, you can just use that Chrome extension and it'll create an Excel sheet for you right there. But again, you want to be careful because, for example, if you were on Naviance and you tried to use ParseHub or Instant Data Scraper, it's a huge no-no. Like that's their proprietary data, and well, you could get in trouble for using it. So even there, just kind of going into some pitfalls. Sorry, Carmen, were you there?
What does scraping data mean? Can you clarify that?
Yeah, so scraping data is essentially copy and pasting. It's just having a computer program copy and paste for you. So think of it as you're simply scraping, you're removing the data from where it is and taking it for your own, which is fine if you're just using it for personal use, but you can get into trouble if you were to scrape a private data source like Naviance and then put forth that data as your own. And that kind of falls under never share the data that's been paid for. And what I mean there is like never share it as like a blog post or something you're marketing or something that you're selling. You can absolutely share it with families. That's the use of it. But in short, you generally want to make sure it's either open use or like fair use, or that you've paid for it and you're using it for like personal use or within your practice use. And finally, with the being conscious of sample population and sample size, that goes back to making sure that it's the right group of people. If I did a political sort of poll, but I only polled people who make over $1 million and live within 5 miles of the beach, it's going to be a very different, response rate than if I, restricted it to the whole U.S. or like, let's say just, Arkansas or like, West Virginia or something. So you do want to be conscious of sample population and sample size. And we'll get into a little bit of math here in a second. But we mentioned earlier, the sample sizes themselves can be skewed. They can be self-selecting, for example. The data sources might be faulty, or they might not be complete. And also, this idea of inputs versus outputs, I have to give John Beckenstedt he's at Oregon State, I think he's VP of their enrollment. I might not get his title perfectly, but his website's Higher Ed Data Stories. Really great data website, and really the visualizations he creates. But he had this concept of inputs or outputs. And for example, it's like, imagine any university claiming, our students graduate within 60 or 90% of our students graduate in 6 years. Is that an output from the university helping those students graduate and at that rate? Or was it an input of the students themselves already being the types of people to finish at a high rate? So you have to kind of figure out, like, is it the chicken or the egg sort of situation, in that, are you inputting a batch of students that would succeed otherwise? Or is it an output that had to do something with the university itself? And going back to the sample size discussion and this idea that if you've been in the business for 10 or 20 years, you probably have a great kind of institutional knowledge to gauge where students will probably get in or not. But across the top, you have the size of the population, and then on the left, you have the margin of error. But if you want to get into a margin of error of plus or minus 3 or 5%, and you want to apply it to the entire country or really the entire world, you only need that column that's under the greater than 5,000, because once you hit that number, that trend is pretty much going to hold true for the whole world. And so if you're even close to 400 instances of data points, so if you've worked with 400 students, you can probably gauge any student in the world where they're going to end up with plus or 5% sort of confidence level. And this is just kind of one of those facts of data where this next slide is going to show that. And this is exactly how election polling works and their confidence intervals. And it's why you see them always poll around 300 to 400 people, because they can get it within that confidence interval. And to get up to that next level of plus or minus 3%, you'd have to jump from under 400 to over 1,000. And that's what this graph shows. And I know the numbers are really small, but the very bottom, if we're talking about your y-axis, is going to be 100 people. I'm sorry, yeah, that'll be 100. The next level up will be 1,000. The next level up will be 10,000. And so, and then along the bottom, you have the smaller margin of error on the left and a greater margin of error on the right. So as you see this go, let's kind of look at it backwards, going from right to left as it rises up. What that's representing is a tighter confidence interval. You're having a more predictive, more accurate understanding of what the result will be, but you have to increase the number of data points. Just like back on this slide, to jump from plus or minus 5% to plus or minus 3% for the whole country, you're looking at 384 people to over 1,000. Here, that's that same thing where the 3% is right at about, or even just a little under 1,000. And then to get it to like a 1% confidence interval, you have to get it up to 10,000. So the idea is you can get it to kind of a good enough confidence interval, and to get it that much tighter, it's going to take way more. You're going to have to even double it. So that's kind of why you always see election data between 3 to 5%, because it really only takes about 3, 4, maybe 500 instances to get that sort of data to be that accurate on a global scale or on a national trend scale. And so then lastly, you know, this kind of comes up a lot more with like the rankings, for example. And I've done other presentations on that where, you know, they're just completely manufactured. They're just fake. You know, to differentiate between anything in the top 100 schools is the craziest thing in the world, because they're already at such a tier of selectivity and exclusivity across the whole world that there's literally no difference between any of the top 100 schools from like a practical perspective, like the education you'll receive and the degree that you'll come out with. But as anything, especially here in America, we love to commodify everything. We love to rank and rate everything. So there's the reality that the rankings are completely fake, completely. And I can go in and back that up with all the data, but that's a different presentation. But the lived reality of the parents and the students is not. That is real. There is a real lived reality. And they're going to look at this fake ranking of the US News and World Report and go, oh, well, Columbia must be better than NYU because Columbia is 5th and NYU is 12th. Insane concept, right? So they're going to have these irrational decisions, and it's because they're only hearing things from their greater, you know, sort of peer group, and those can be sometimes limiting, especially as adults. And so even if you know all of this, and even if you have the data, they may not want to hear it, and it may actually be worse if you dive into it. So a lot of this and a lot of the data or insights you can glean from it will be things that you hold for your well-being and understanding of greater admissions, but the families might not only not want to hear it, but outright disagree with you. And lastly, this other one that this concept that admissions rates are like a lottery. Okay, because here's the thing, even on the test prep side, I've worked with enough students and heard from enough families and seen enough, you know, application seasons that it's legitimately hard for me not to laugh when someone says, oh, we're thinking about Stanford. Oh, Harvard's on our list. Like, I mean, just get out. Like, it's not happening. And I know that it's like, oh, don't be a dream killer, Eric. But here's the thing. When you factor in athletes and legacies and donors and even students that just are like valedictorians with all the perfect scores and all the perfect everything, Stanford has an incoming class of like 1,200 students. More than, I'd say 3/4 of that's filled between all the different groups I mentioned, plus something like early decision or early action. So if there's maybe 200 or 300 spots left, why you? Like seriously, that's fewer people than play in the NBA right now. Like that's fewer people in English Premier League soccer. And oh, just because you've always wanted to go there, like no. And so I think taking a little bit more of a cynical approach, because these are businesses that we're dealing with. The schools are in business; they have to keep their bottom line. That they kind of prey, and the system kind of preys on families saying, "Well, we'll take a shot. You never know." But to a certain extent, you kind of do. And having a more reasoned college list, I think, is going to result in much better expectations and results for everyone than just slapping your top 20 U.S. News and World Report schools down and saying, we'll take a shot. So it's tough to navigate, though, is the hard part. Even if you know the truths, the families might not want to hear it. But just to kind of wrap up real quickly, data is definitely important. It's every single part of college admissions and higher education. Don't be afraid of it. If you have deeper questions, I'm more of a data appreciator. I like to dabble in it, but I'm in no way like a data scientist or someone that does it for my business every day, day in and day out. So feel free to reach out to me. Lee is also available, and really, I'd almost put a caveat in there that if you open up Pandora's box and start asking Lee about data, you might be there a while. She really likes to go into a ton of detail and get granular with it. And it really is fun to see those insights expand out. But also, hopefully we covered enough where and how to access the data. If there's any questions on that, feel free to ask now or follow up via email. And hopefully it's been valuable and something to at least give you that quick overview intro. But that's going to be it. And we also, we can follow up with the slides, and we have all the resources here as well. So thanks a bunch, guys. And I have time. I know we went a couple minutes over. I think we just had an hour, but we're around if you guys have any Q&A stuff.
There is one question in the chat. How do we break students and parents from them getting caught up in the insanity of chasing after the top-ranked colleges driven by peers, social media, etc.?
How do you?
Yeah, I deal with the same thing. Because and I can tell you from the test prep side, it's just as bad. I had students who had a 33 on the ACT, and they were like, should we send it or not? And then one of those students was actually going to go back and take it again. And that's, 20 hours of tutoring over, 6 weeks plus all this homework. And is that even worth it? Because here's the thing too, a 33 and a 36 student are the exact same student. I guarantee you it's the exact same student on any given day. That 33 could get a 36. They missed 4 or 5 questions, and it was probably human error. But, I think to me, the way to help families really understand it is really just talking about money. I think that's the big equalizer, because if they have unlimited funds, or if they're willing to simply pay for brand name, knock yourself out. That's what, Lamborghinis are for. That's what, I don't know, Gucci or Dior, like any sort of brand is for. Like if you have the money, go knock yourself out. But most families don't. And I think if you talk to them about their real core desire, is that brand name going to be worth an extra $50,000 a year? And to most people, I would say no, because that's the difference between helping your kid buy a condo when they graduate or not, or having that much debt or not. So I think being realistic with where they're at with cost, it is kind of the one great equalizer. But at the same time, because it's such an identity thing where people get irrational about college admissions because they want the brand, they want to be able to brag to their friends, well, my kid got into this school. But because it's also a shorthand for signaling in American society. Like, we're good because we got into this school. Like we have wealth, so we demonstrate goodness, right? So it's a hard question to answer directly, but I think end game, even at 32, going back to 10 years out from college, do you want your kid to be happy? Do you want them to be gainfully employed and something they enjoy doing, that has a career future, and they have the means to have whatever type of family they want? To me, that's the great equalizer.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And can you flip back to your resource page? People are wanting to see that.
Sure. Can we just a second here?
And as everybody, this will be available. I'll be sending out the recording. The presentation will be available through SlideShare so that you're able to review this and have all these links. And in fact, we'll just copy these links and put them in the post as well. So Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. We've got a lot of great comments. This is very illuminating. I think going back to the question that was posed is how do we break parents of some of these notions and these not passion, but fascination with the select few reductive colleges. Using data as your best source. It gives you an outside, viable, an objective point that you can use. You may not, as you said, Eric, you may not disabuse them always or very much, but at least it gives you a tool that you can use in your toolbox that can be very effective. And if you've got engineers and people who do those spreadsheets, that data sometimes is very hard to ignore. So emotion always comes into it, even on the financial aid side, we run into that as well. So this has been very helpful. So,
and I do want to say one quick thing too. This is more about like the test optional movement and everything. I just want to reiterate, I'm very anti-test. The SAT and ACT don't really test much at all beyond basic reading skills. And this goes for the new digital SAT too, and some basic math. And they kind of prey on tricky wording and human fatigue and other stuff. But there's a big difference between knowing something and then seeing it. And if you look at test prep and stuff, students in high schools are pretty much taught to know things, right? You have to recall it, you have to memorize it, you have to use the formula. But test prep's created in a way that you typically just don't see it. And you can tell that because when you review, if you review with someone who doesn't know something, they're like, okay, that's interesting, I get that now. But when they're not seeing it, you get that aha moment. You get that, oh, that's all it was, because they actually knew it, but they just didn't see it. But that sensation of not knowing is the same as not seeing. And so students feel like it's them and it's not the test. So in short, they are totally coachable. They're annoying. But the thing with test optional and the tests in general is that I think test optional is a propaganda mechanism by the universities to get out of doing what they should do and go test blind. Because to me, test optional is just, we'll accept your application fee and your application, but will you get in or not, it's up to whoever. So hopefully it's some steps in the right direction with the UC and Cal State system going that direction and stuff. But I mean, the APs are just as bad, so don't get me started on them too.
Lots of topics for the future to cover, right?
No, definitely. I got some decent gripes. I mean, this is my 17th year in tutoring and test prep, and I think the bigger thing is just that when you see what students go through and how much hard work they put in, it's put it this way. Each AP course is about 5 hours of work a week, just in their standard. Think of any of our lives as adults right now, and think of just incorporating one book club, right? Which would maybe take you like a half hour, an hour a week if you're part of a book club. I don't have time for that. And we're asking students to pile in all this other stuff. So, but hey, if it's a value to the family and they want to pursue it, we'll help them get there. I've kind of compared it to, I kind of feel like a lawyer knowing that the criminal justice system has its faults, but you still represent your clients. That's kind of me in tutoring and higher ed. But very much so, I want to say thank you to everyone attending. And if you have any other follow-up or questions or insights, especially on the data, Lee's always available, but you can find her through me too.